Here is our commemorative vignette for today. About 50 years ago, in 1945, during the disinfection procedure, 182 Jews die in the Ebensee concentration camp in Austria. They had been evacuated from the Gross Rosen concentration camp in Silesia.
I've been given the privilege to step down from behind the TV camera today and introduce a gentleman who has brought a very, very significant program to this campus. Dr. Richard Paul is the director of the Center for Critical Thinking and Moral Critique here on this campus. Before I make the introduction, I would just like to mention to you all that yesterday, Mr. Steiner and myself visited the Anne Frank exhibit in Corte Madera Town Center. And we found it very, very significant, very, very well done. And we would advise you all, if you have a chance to go, to see it. It will be there until April 7th. Dr. Paul is an internationally recognized authority on critical thinking. 5 books on critical thinking and 50 more articles dealing with kindergarten to 12th grade critical thinking. Dr. Paul has given in lectures at a lot of colleges and universities, including Harvard, Universities of Puerto Rico and Costa Rica. And in addition, as many of us know, there's a program here, big program here in the summer and elsewhere. I had workshops on critical thinking in every region in the United States, serving more than 10,000 kindergarten to 12th grade and higher education teachers and leaders in the past decade. One thing we have to remember, and why this lecture today is so important, is that genocides don't progress without an ideology. The majority has an ideology that is upon the minority, and that helps make it go. If we learn to think critically and analytically, we're not going to become susceptible to the extremes in ideology. Now, that's why it's so important. But without further ado, Dr. Richard Paul.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be back, having an opportunity to share some thoughts about questions that I think all of us share. Before I begin and approach the topic of the day specifically, I want to mention a couple of things about the background which I will be presupposing. In human life, action is almost always in the foreground. We act. And we act the way we do for a variety of reasons, many of which are not apparent to us at the time that we act. We act in some situation as we perceive the situation, and our action, whether we recognize it or not, is a function of how we think about the situation and about ourselves in that situation. Our action, in other words, reflects our thinking. And our emotions and our feelings are correlated just as much with our thinking. If you are afraid, it's because you think something is threatening you. If you are angry, it's because you think someone or something has wronged you and that wrong has not been righted. If, on the other hand, you think that no one has wronged you, you will not be angry. Anger, fear, excitement, apathy, boredom, every single emotion that you can feel mirrors your thinking. Now, you cannot directly step into your mind and change your feelings. Though we think we can, we cannot immediately and easily change our behavior unless we change the thinking that is guiding that behavior. So what I do, if this makes some sense to you, is step back and look at a broad category of actions, and then look at the thinking that is leading to or guiding those actions. And I want to think aloud in front of you, explaining my thinking to you, and if what I'm saying makes sense to you in the light of your experience, if it makes sense in the light of your own ideas and beliefs, then your mind will move along with mine in a direction which I think is potentially very powerful. On the other hand, if my examples do not ring true, or my thoughts are moving along lines very different from yours, you may find that you cannot see how I'm getting from here to there, or why it would be a reasonable move to make. So let me begin. The question I want to focus on is basically this: what renders humans capable of unspeakable cruelty? I begin, of course, with the assumption that we are capable of it, and I believe history shows that we're capable of it. I also want to raise a parallel question. Upon what basis can we judge someone's behavior to be unspeakably cruel? And how can we know that our judgment is reasonable and fair? These are the questions that I put forward and reflect upon with you today. And I want to suggest that they can be answered, and that the answer is significant. I want to suggest with you that at the most general level, at the most basic level, what leads us in the direction of being capable of unspeakable cruelty is a prior judgment that is almost always connected with group allegiance and an egocentric identification with that group allegiance that comes in three interrelated beliefs. We are different, we are special, we are superior. And when the human mind comes to this judgment, we are special, we are different, we are superior, it easily leads itself to the judgment that they, being not special, being inferior, need not be treated as we are treated, need not be thought of as we must be thought of, need not have the conditions which we must have. And I see three structures as connected with this danger: national allegiance, religious allegiance, and cultural allegiance. And I want to put it to you, and I would like to reflect with you on the fact that these allegiances, when egocentrically held, that is, connected with the notion that our group is special, our group is different, our group is superior, these allegiances show a historical tendency to manifest themselves when the group is threatened by unspeakable cruelties. To give you an example from history, I want to suggest that these examples that there are almost endless examples. I simply want to take some that stand out. This is, I'm reading from the History of England by David Hume. This was published in 1776. And David Hume is talking about crusades that occurred around the year 100 AD, the time of Henry I. He's describing the Crusaders as they approached Jerusalem. And at that time, there was the Sultan of Egypt, whose allegiance, and I'm reading from the text, they had hitherto courted, recovered on the fall of the Turkish power his former authority in Jerusalem. And he informed them by his ambassadors that if they came armed to that city, they might now perform their religious vows, and that all Christian pilgrims who should thenceforth visit the Holy Sepulchre might expect the same good treatment which they had ever received from his predecessors. The offer was rejected. The Sultan was required to yield up the city to the Christians. And on his refusal, the champions of the cross did the siege of Jerusalem, which they regarded as the consummation of their labors. By the detachments which they had made and the disasters which they had undergone, they had diminished to the number 20,000 foot and 1,500 horse. But these were still formidable from their valor, their experience, and the obedience which, from past calamities, they had learned to pay to their leaders. After a siege of 5 weeks, they took Jerusalem by assault. And now it becomes very interesting with respect to our concerns here. And impelled by a mixture of military and religious rage, they put the numerous garrison and inhabitants to the sword without distinction. Neither arms defended the valiant, nor submission the timorous. No age or sex was spared. On the breast were pierced by the same blow with their mothers, who implored for mercy. Even a multitude to the number of 10,000 persons who had surrendered themselves prisoners and were promised quarter were butchered in cold blood by those ferocious conquerors. The streets of Jerusalem were covered with dead bodies, and the triumphant warriors, after every enemy was subdued and slaughtered, immediately turned themselves with the sentiments of humiliation and contrition toward the Holy Sepulchre. They threw aside their arms, still streaming with blood. They advanced with reclining bodies and naked feet and heads to their sacred monument. They sung anthems to their Savior, who had there purchased their salvation by his death and agony. And their devotion, enlivened by the presence of the place where he had suffered, so overcame their feet that they dissolved in tears and bore the appearance of every soft and tender sentiment. So inconsistent is human nature with itself, says David Hume, and continues on. Now, to the extent that this is true, and I think even if the details are not true perfectly, I think they mirror a human capacity. Here were warriors who were committed to a religious cause and pursuing this cause under the concept of the Prince of Peace. And as we all know, the teachings of the New Testament were to love thy neighbor as thyself. But the group allegiance, the conception of themselves as superior, different, of being on a holy mission, rendered them capable of unspeakable cruelty. And then, hardly a moment's pause, their cruelty and their religious devotion. How is this something of which humans are capable? I want to suggest that what it requires is massive self-delusion. And that this massive self-delusion is encouraged by the sort of nationalism, the sort of religious zealotry, and the kind of cultural imperialism which naturally flows from a kind of egocentric allegiance to the group. Think for a moment about what is going on in the former area of Yugoslavia. Think of the Bosnians, the Croatians, and the Serbs. What are they doing these days? And you know that each of them, not all equally, are engaging in unspeakable cruelties. And is that possible? The judgment, I am a Croatian, I am not a Serb. I am a Serb, I am not a Muslim. If they couldn't make that judgment, and if they didn't feel that allegiance, they would not be engaged in the slaughter. Think about the Second World War and the First World War and the previous wars, and notice how essential national allegiance was to the fact of those wars. And how religious allegiance has played through the history of especially Western peoples. I am myself an amateur student of English history, and as I read English history, I see religious-inspired ferocity and cruelty throughout the history of England. And if one goes back to the earliest days of English history, if you'll remember with me, original people were called Britons, and they were invaded by the Saxons. And after a bit of time, a couple of hundred years, there was hardly a Briton left. The country became almost totally Saxon. So that the country was, the indigenous population was largely wiped out, exterminated. And then with the Norman invasions, a similar process, except the Saxons were not completely wiped out, they were significantly assimilated. So that again and again when we look about, we see group allegiance, we see unspeakable cruelty, and we see self-delusion, closely correlated with each other. Now let me take an example that is much more mundane at the level of cruelty, but it seems to me illustrates how easy it is, blinded by national sentiments, and so to become self-deluded. Very recently, I was on a plane and I was reading USA Today, and I came across an editorial, a guest editorial, on Cuba. And it said, "Worst is over for Castro's Cuba," and there was, of course, a caricature of Castro smoking a cigar on the front. And this particular editorial writer was arguing that it's time to end the embargo. And in arguing for that, he mentioned one fact right toward the end, and it surprised me. And the fact that I was surprised, in the light of my background, reminds me of how easy it is to be taken in by propaganda. Here is what it says. The United Nations voted 101 to 2 last year to condemn the embargo. And I thought, 101 to 2? My God, we must be really alone in the world. Our thinking about Cuba must be extraordinarily idiosyncratic. Why is it that I haven't heard about this? Why isn't it that this UN vote wasn't covered in the news? Because as you know, it wasn't covered in the news. Well, the reason it wasn't covered in the news was because it went against us. And when we cover the news, we tell it from our point of view. We are special, we are different, we are superior. And even if the whole of the world is against us, they are wrong. We are right. We are different, we are special, we are superior. Now, interestingly enough, it says, only Israel voted with us, and it trades with Cuba. So that the one country that voted with us, which is our close ally, nevertheless doesn't honor the embargo. So that means that we're the only country that really believes that it's justified. Now, I'm not concerned with our policy on Cuba here, but I am concerned about the fact we don't perceive ourselves as having an extreme position. And I would take it as given that if there are many nations in the world and we stand alone, humility alone and awareness of self-deception should lead us to say, why? What are we missing? What is it that other people see that we don't see? Now, maybe upon that reflection, we decide that we're right. But what I see in the media, not that reflection, but the continual assumption, we are different, we are special, we are superior. So that when, on rare occasions, I come across a fact like this, I myself am surprised, because though I try to be well-informed and to read books that are printed by and written by people who are not North Americans, nevertheless, because I live within the media, which is continually cranking out a way of looking at things and presupposing that this is the truth, that I lose sense of how much we ourselves, like everyone else, are susceptible to self-delusion. So what I say is the first step in the direction away from Holocaust as unspeakable cruelty is the recognition we are not special, we are not different, we are not superior. That what others are capable of, we are capable of. The cruelty that others can do, we can do. This, I think, is the hardest step to take in an honest way. Because our own egos, which exist in all of us as humans, continually move us toward the comfortable, the pleasant, serving. The basic premise of the ego is always to protect us, to put us in this special protected way. And only if we are truly strong and truly honest can we have self-esteem that is not based on self-deception. Now, I want to go a step further and deal for a while with the second part of the question. How are we capable of unspeakable cruelty is the first part. The second part is who is to judge this and upon what basis do we judge? And here we enter into the realm of critical thinking. What brings us to oneness, that is the opposite of we are different, but what brings us to oneness as creatures capable of suffering, what enables us to judge reasonably and fairly, I believe, is a focus on three things. Basic standards of reasonable thought, basic moral concepts, and basic need. These, I think, are universals. And I want to put to you this general thesis that national thinking, cultural thinking, and religious thinking do not judge rationality and morality, but rationality and morality judge religious thinking, national thinking, and cultural thinking. Now, why do I say that, and upon what basis do I say that, and what thinking has led me to that conclusion? It is this, that what you find amongst nations when they express themselves in their nationality is diverse difference. Every nation has its own particular way of looking at things. Every culture has its way of looking at things. Every religion has its own way of looking at things. And gravitates, nevertheless, toward the notion it is special, it is different. it is superior. It is very hard to find a religion that says, we are at one with all other religions. We're not superior. We're not closer to God. We're one way. No better, no worse. Rather, religions move in the direction, we are special, we are different, we are superior. The correct religion. Who has it? The Muslims are sure they have it. Various sects of Protestant Christianity believe that they have it. Catholicism believes it has it. Buddhists of some varieties think that they have it. And so if we look at religion in its diversity, it does not provide a foundation for judgment. Because religions conflict. Nations conflict. Cultures conflict. But what joins us are principles that cannot be questioned. And I want to show you how you can see that this is so. Well, let us suppose that some national ideology argues that reason is of no value or is inferior to a kind of national ideology which has been generated by any particular nation at any time that you might choose. Then how could they prove that this is so? They would either give reasons why this is so, thereby contradicting themselves, or they could give us poor reasons why this is so, and therefore we'd have no reason to listen to them. Reason cannot be judged by anything but reason. And an irrational attack on reason gives you no reason to abandon it. Now, I want to be very specific about this because this is fairly abstract. Let me turn to one concept that is an integral concept to the notion of reasoning and being reasonable. Here is such a word. It's a simple word, the word evidence. Now, what does this word mean? If you look it up in the dictionary, you probably find some kind of an entry like this. It's something that makes something else evident. Something that makes something else evident. And you might say, that's no help. But actually it is. If you think about it, you need two things to have evidence. Something and something that is shown by it. What shows you that someone who claimed to be your friend really isn't your friend? Whatever that is, it's evidence. What shows you that the chemical constitution of water is 2 parts of hydrogen and 1 part of oxygen? Whatever shows that, that's evidence. What shows you that you're fearing something that you ought not to fear? Whatever shows that, that is evidence. That is one of the things that we need to use that we cannot avoid using in our life is evidence. Now, we can be wrong when we think that something that we think shows something else may be perhaps doesn't. That is, we can be wrong about what we take to be evidence in a particular case. But can we reject evidence? Do you see? Evidence is a part of reason. Can we reject it? Can we say, I'm sorry, I don't believe in evidence? See, this is the mental act I'd like you to try to perform. Could someone knowingly reject evidence in general? I will not be guided by evidence. I will be guided by something else. That means that when something shows something to be so, you won't believe it. How then could you live your life? You cannot avoid honoring evidence. Evidence is unquestionable. That is the very idea of it. And so what we need to recognize, if you follow this light, and I'm going to give you other examples, is that what we cannot reject is reason. Reason enables us to judge, but cannot itself be judged except by itself. Now let me put this another way. The basic principles of reason are intuitive. That is, you reach a point where you cannot go further in the questioning process. Let me give you an example. Suppose somebody says, welfare is corrupt. And I say, that's not a clear statement. I'd like a specification of that. In what sense do you mean that? And someone says then, okay, what I mean is the very principle of giving one person or group goods and services that somebody else earned is morally wrong because it's theft from the one person and giving to another what a first person has earned by the sweat of their brow. And that's morally wrong. So I'm saying that welfare is a form of theft. Okay, now we know much more clearly what the person means. We don't know yet whether we agree with them, perhaps, but we know what they mean. Now suppose somebody says, okay, that's more clear, but why be clear? Why be clear at all? Now, we have to ask this person, could you please clarify what you mean by why be clear at all? Because that's not clear. Just my point. Why be clear? I don't even accept clarity. That makes no sense. The basic standard of clarity is used to judge statements, to distinguish the clear from the unclear. But you cannot say you reject clarity. Suppose I said to you, the unity of being is the being of unity, which in its transcendent manifold integrates and differentiates the essence of non-being. Do you agree? Do you disagree? You can neither agree nor disagree because what I've said is not clear. And you recognize that unless clarity exists, you can do nothing else with my thought. In other words, clarity is essential, intuitively unavoidable to the thinking mind. One doesn't reject clarity, one honors it. Here's another standard that is eternal and universal in thinking: accuracy. It would make no sense for someone to say, I reject accuracy. I don't care whether my statements are accurate or inaccurate. I see no reason for it. Why should I be accurate? This is a basic principle of rationality. In other words, when somebody makes a claim, we can raise the question as rational persons. How do you know that's so? And of course, then we have to use this other word that I've already... What is your evidence? And if the person says, I don't care what's so, and I don't use evidence, there's nothing we can do with this person. They are hopeless. Let's go a step further. What's another standard? Universal standard of rationality. In other words, I'm not talking about what divides us. I'm talking about what unites us as creatures capable of reason. Because this capability, every person in every culture has. Every person in every nation has. Every person in every religion has this capability to see the importance of being clear, of being accurate. And no one in any culture or religion can say we don't care about clarity or accuracy. Here's another universal standard: relevance. I raise a question, I make a point, and you make a point which you think is against my point. I say, I don't see the relevance of your point. How does it connect? You say, I don't care whether it connects. I never concern myself with what is relevant. I reject relevance as a standard. You see, to reject reason, you must reject things like evidence, clarity, accuracy, and relevance, and that doesn't make sense. These standards cannot be rejected except by someone who doesn't understand them. Let's take another standard of reason: superficiality versus depth. We are talking together. We consider the question of drug abuse, the drug problem. One person chimes in and they say, the drug problem, that's easy. Just say no. And we say, well, I understand clearly what you're saying. They pass clarity. If everyone would say no, then there wouldn't be a drug problem. What they say is accurate. If everyone offered a drug, they said no, no drug problem. So what they've said is clear and accurate. Is it relevant? Certainly. If there was some way to get everyone who should not accept a drug to refuse it, we wouldn't have a drug problem. So what they've said is clear, it's accurate, and it's relevant. But it is superficial as well. It is not deep. Why? Because we need another standard here, it's depth. And what is that connected to? Again, these go back to things so basic that I sometimes wonder how people can seriously question reason. And I realize, of course, they just don't understand it. Well, here's what this goes back to. Some problems are complex. I take that as a given. I also would argue that the drug problem is a complex problem. What does that mean? What does it mean to say that some problems are complex? It means inherent in them are systems of difficulties which must be dealt with to solve the problem successfully. And a reasonable person will deal with these complexities. Just say no does not deal with the complexities. And therefore, it's a superficial answer. Now, insight into the importance of depth has been recognized by many thinkers, and let me mention one. This is L. Mencken, great conservative American journalist of the 20s and 30s, and he said this: for every complex question, there is a simple answer, and it is wrong. And his point was that there are times when we need to think with depth. And you cannot reject depth unless you're a superficial mind. You can reject it, but not justifiably. But that is not all that rationality and reasoning offers us. It offers us other standards as well. And one is breadth, broad-mindedness. Now here, again, I can hear the voice that says, why should I be broad-minded? What do I get out of it? What if I reject broad-mindedness? And by the way, I see one of the problems of national allegiance, religious allegiance, and cultural allegiance when centric to reject broad-mindedness. Because when you think broadly, it's hard to say, we are special, we are different, we are superior. Now, let me give you an example of broad-mindedness. You can think deeply and yet not broadly. Broad-mindedness comes into play as a requirement of the reasonable person when there's more than one look at a complex phenomenon. And when there's more than one way to look at it, as a reasonable person, you try to look at it in more than one way. And you recognize that you can be blinded by one-sidedness, intellectual myopicness. And national allegiance tends to be myopic. When there was a war over what the British called the Falkland Islands, all the Argentinian newspapers said, Argentina's right. And all the British papers said, Britain is right. Because national allegiance tends to be myopic. Great scholars will spend their life justifying national ideology. They will write books and books and books with great depth, dealing with tremendous complexity, but one predictable feature. They always defend that one side. You always know where they're going to be. They're going to be on that side of that particular nation, that particular group that they have sold their intellectual conscience to. They no longer see the need to be broad, to be open, to hear multiple voices. They will listen to multiple voices, but only to show that the one voice is special, different, is superior. let us now move from the intellectual to the moral. Because you remember I said there were three bases upon which we can achieve unity as creatures capable of suffering. And I'm arguing that until or to the degree we achieve unity as creatures capable of suffering, we're going to lack what we need to avoid unspeakable cruelty. Take this very concept, cruelty. Now, very often I hear unsophisticated persons say, that's a moral concept. In moral concepts, everyone has his own definition. So what I mean by it, what you mean by it, and he means, and she means, we're all different, and it's okay. I have a right to my opinion, you have yours, she has hers, they have theirs. But if this is true, we cannot judge anyone as being cruel. All we can say is, in our particular way of defining it, idiosyncratic as it is, we judge it to be cruel. This is to miss the essence of cruelty. It is not open to anything you choose to call it. It captures something which our minds, when it understands, get. In other words, it captures a moral intuition, which is universal. And here's the moral intuition. No one has the right to inflict unnecessary pain and suffering on innocent creatures or persons. That's the insight. No one, no group, at any time has the right to inflict undeserving suffering on innocent creatures and persons. If you cannot see the truth of that, you are morally blind. It doesn't matter what your ideology is. You miss the moral insight, which is universal. It is not a product of any nation. It is not a product of any religion. It is not a product of any culture, because it transcends culture, it transcends nation, it transcends language, it transcends ideology. It's an intuition. You see it or you don't. No one has the right to inflict undeserved suffering on innocent creatures or persons. Now, you can only see this if you transcend egocentricity. Because egocentricity will say, they're not undeserving, because we are special, we are different, we are superior, so we have the right to do this. This is no longer undeserving. In other words, they lose the capacity to follow this intuition to its fundamental judgment point, because an ideology stands in the way and skews their judgment. So, where does this put us? What this suggests is that each of us has a capacity within us to be reasonable, to be moral, and to be responsive to basic need. But we also have another capacity, and that's the capacity to attach ourselves to a group and to experience that group as special, as superior, as different, and as legitimating our treating the people in this group different from the people outside of the group. It enables us to close ourselves off from our common as creatures capable of suffering. And you'll notice I said creatures capable of suffering. I didn't say humans. Because one of the capacities which I want to suggest that is still a problem in our basic morality is that we say of our species, we are special, we are different, we are superior, and therefore treat other species as if their suffering doesn't matter. Because, after all, they're not human. They lack reason in the sense that we have it. They lack moral intuitions in the sense that we have them. And therefore we can treat them as we will. And people sometimes even say, God has said that we may do this, and therefore we may do this. Because God intended these creatures by us as we see fit. And if we treat them cruelly, it's not really cruelty, because they are different. They are inferior. They don't feel what we feel. But here is the intuition that corrects us. They are capable of suffering. And we must be one with all creatures capable of suffering. This is, to me, the essence of morality. When you become one with all creatures capable of suffering, you become a moral person. And to the extent that there is in you the capacity to separate yourself from creatures who can suffer and countenance their suffering with no pangs of conscience, with no concerns or regrets, with no informed outrage or sense of injustice, then you have lost touch with those basic intuitions that you have deep down underneath everything else, and that you are no longer using your reason in justice sake, but you're using your reason to justify we are special, we are different, we are superior. Now, I want to close by showing you a film clip. And this is only going to take about 10 minutes. And then I want questions and dialogue, because I'm sure many of you have questions, many of you have points you want to make, many of you perhaps disagree with me on this point or that, and that is perfectly fair. As a person who aspires to reason, I must listen to all your criticisms and make sure that I hear them and try to be fair in responding to them. And I want to do that. So let us first view this, and I'm sure that as you see it, you will see the challenge I'm putting before you, and you will see that how difficult it is to achieve unity with all creatures capable of suffering. And now, how does this relate to the Holocaust? Very, very directly. Because if you have this sensitivity, you will be a person who will never countenance unspeakable cruelty in any form. So let us see this, and then as soon as it's finished, I'll say a couple of closing words, and then we'll go to discussion. Can we turn down these lights?
The only thing we can do is turn them off.
Why don't we turn them off?
Right. Somebody hit the switch over there, please, by the door.
Downed animal or downer. Just the expressions conjure up images lying half forgotten in a dark corner. Sadly, this nightmarish vision is an all too common sight at stockyards and auctions across the United States. Downed animal, or downer, are industry terms used to refer to animals who are too sick or weak even. Every year, millions of farm animals are trucked to stockyards and auctions across the United States, and every year, thousands go down and are unable to get back up. Downed animals suffer gross negligence and abuse at stockyards and auctions every day. Stockyards and auctions are transfer points where animals are bought and sold. While at these facilities, animals are in legal limbo. Neither the sellers, the buyers, nor the auctions technically own the animals, and no one takes responsibility for their proper care. Auctions blame farmers, who blame truckers, who blame buyers. The fact is, all of these parties share the responsibility. The downed animal problem begins on farms where sick and injured animals are denied veterinary care because providing such care is not economically profitable. If an animal only $30, for example, a farmer is not likely to pay a veterinarian $40 to treat the animal. Unless agribusiness can realize a return on its investment, the investment, including veterinary treatment, is not likely to be made. Concerned with maximizing profit, farmers push unhealthy animals to produce in spite of illness. Sick, emaciated dairy cows are milked for every last drop. When they can walk to the milking parlor to give milk, they are trucked to the auction. Breeding sows, whose legs give out as a result of genetic manipulation and confinement housing, are also sent to auctions when the pork industry can no longer use them. For their part, truckers overload farm animals onto livestock trucks. The severe crowding contributes to hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries annually. Referring to the overcrowding of hogs in transportation, a Penn State hog specialist, death losses during transport are too high, amounting to more than $8 million per year. Over 250 hogs show up dead at packing plants every day. But it doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure why we load as many hogs as we do. It's cheaper. Even a zero death rate associated with providing more space on the truck would not be enough to pay for the increased transportation costs of hauling fewer hogs on a load. Cattle, goats, sheep also suffer horribly in tightly packed trucks. According to Texas A&M research, the cattle industry loses $500 million annually to a single transportation illness, appropriately called shipping fever. Financial losses resulting from dead, sick, and injured animals are tolerated as acceptable economic losses to the callous livestock industry. Agribusiness is well aware that it could save lives and lessen animal suffering by giving more room on trucks, but for the sake of profit, it continues to overcrowd animals. An industry expert asks, is it right to overload trucks and save 25 cents per head in the process while the overcrowding contributes to the deaths of 80,000 hogs each year? Farm animals also suffer during loading and unloading. Livestock handlers use whips and electric prods, and animals are often injured. According to the Livestock Marketing Nation, bruising alone costs the industry $46 million each year. Here we see a load of hogs panic-stricken as they are shocked during unloading. Two of the pigs get wedged in the door while the rest pile up behind them, scrambling frantically to avoid being shocked. At the auction, weary, confused animals must negotiate steep ramps, narrow walkways, and a series of holding pens. In instances, animals arrive at the auction extremely weak, barely able to walk. In other cases, animals are too sick even to stand, and they are dragged off the trucks, usually with chains. Stockyards and auctions have become dumping grounds where farmers can, in their own words, get rid of their trash. Sick, lame, and diseased animals are sent to stockyards and auctions every day, along with frail and unwanted newborns. The unwanted male offspring of dairy, for example, are useless to the dairy industry, and so they are trucked to auctions, sometimes on the same day they are born. This baby goat was actually born at an auction. His mother was sold for slaughter. Since the industry couldn't use him, he was left at the auction to die. Livestock handlers typically increase blows and shocks, attempting to make downed animals stand and walk.
Look at she's dragging herself. Look that. Look at that.
When the animals fail to stand, they are often left to lie where they fall, their basic needs completely ignored. The grounds of stockyards and auctions are littered with the bodies of dead and dying animals. Downed animals left in walkways or pens are at risk for being trampled and further injured by other animals through the auction. Additionally, downed animals are immobile and cannot get to food and water troughs. Because auctions are not set up to provide downed animals with food and water on an individual basis, the animals commonly lay for hours or days without receiving these basic needs, and many die of gross neglect. This goat, suffering from a broken back, writhes in agony on the stockyard floor. This pig suffers from a maggot-infested wound on his front leg. This sheep was literally thrown on a dead heap while still alive. This calf was tossed in a corner of the stockyard. Useless to the industry, he was left to die a slow, painful death. Downed animals suffer intolerable abuse and neglect every day at stockyards and auctions across the United States. They are of little value and therefore little concern to agribusiness. They are discards of the industry. The animals may sell for as little as $1, yet they can be left to suffer for days for the sake of that last dollar. This is a system where economic interests take precedence over moral concerns. No consideration is given to the fact that these are living sentients who experience pain and suffering. Downers who survive the stockyard are dragged to slaughter. In addition to abrasions and bruises, dragging results in other injuries, including broken bones and torn ligaments. Even the industry's most ardent defenders admit that dragging animals causes suffering.
Okay, if I could have the lights. The sequence, as you can imagine, goes on for some further distance, and I will leave it to your imagination to conjure it up. My point in raising this is to suggest to you that the phenomenon of unspeakable cruelty, I certainly am not implying that is parallel to or comparable to the Holocaust, but I think you can see the analogy, which I'm seeing here, of persons who can be blind to cruelty and can operate within its visible surroundings and yet not feel anything. I mean, how was it that guards at Dachau and Auschwitz could go home and eat their dinner and be with their children? It's because they could separate themselves from the people who were suffering. And this ability to separate yourself from suffering, I think I would suggest, is here, or disability if you like, to separate yourself from suffering, is here in these mundane acts which do occur in our very society. And it's extremely difficult to get people to empathize with creatures. Why? They are not human. They're different. We are special. We're humans. And so only with the ability, what I'm arguing, only the ability to break down these walls of separation and to become one with all suffering creatures, whether human or non-human, can we move in the direction of ending forever unspeakable cruelty perpetrated by humans. To do this, we have to develop our rational capacities and our moral capacities. Because if our rational capacities are not developed, propaganda, manipulation, cultural ideology, or religious ideology wrongly understood can substitute in our minds for these intuitions. Reason can be dismissed. Basic moral concepts can be set aside unless the mind is disciplined sufficiently to be able to focus on them and give them their... This is the message which I bring to you, and I thank you very much for your patience in watching those scenes, which have to be morally troubling to anyone who sees them. And we have one person who wants to pose a question right at the outset and make some comments, and then the floor will be open for all others. So thank you very much for your patience. So, what kind of comment would you like to make? And by the way, would you mind making your comment from the chair? Because otherwise I would want everyone to come up and take the mic, and I'd prefer not to do that. Thank you. Go ahead.
As a few people here know, I am a veterinarian. And critical thinking is, this is a very good place for this picture. Because this picture gives you an impression of things that are not true. As a veterinarian, in my younger days, I wore the badge of the U.S. Meat Inspection Division. I was in charge of an entire slaughtering facility. And I mean in charge. Veterinarians have that power. We used to joke that if I raised my hand, I would cost Swift $300 a minute. Now, none of this that you have seen would ever occur at that time. This is 30 years ago, and the laws are even better now. Now, what you're seeing here is before the animal ever gets to a slaughterhouse. These are private groups that do the auctioning.
about how accurate it is, so reasonable persons would then have to look to find out the degree to which it is accurate. I believe this is representative of a significant reality which is largely unattended to in our society. And I do know of people, I'm not myself an activist in the animal rights movement, but I do know people who are, and there's an association of veterinarians concerned with animal rights. And there was a bill before the California legislature to deal with this problem, and the food processing industry fought that bill because they apparently saw this as threatening to their particular way of doing things. In any case, I respect your judgment, and this is what we have to concern ourselves. Is such a thing taking place? Or is it an illusion? Other comments? Yes, way in the back. Why don't we start from the back? Go ahead.
We just saw the pictures. Obviously, that occurs. But the point, I'm not clear. Right after the film, you immediately said that these are not comparable to the Nazi atrocities in the 40s. But you showed the film in a lecture that's titled
Right.
the subject.
So your question is how can you do that? What's your point?
No, in essence, yes. But the treatment of animals, farm animals, domestic animals, is something that humans control. Without humans, there would be no domestic animals. Without domestic animals, the world population wouldn't be half as what it is today. Obviously, that occurs. We saw the pictures. But how is that at all comparable to humans lining up other humans to decimate them? Not for food, not to make money.
Well, if they were eating them, would that make you less concerned? If they were eating Jews, would that make you less concerned?
That didn't happen. That wasn't the case. That's an irrelevant point.
Well,
Okay? So
I think, you see, the point that I was intending to make, I hope most people saw it, is that if you're capable of missing one unspeakable cruelty by saying that's different, doesn't matter there, then you're going to be the kind of person who in another context are going to miss cruelties because you're going to be able to say that's different, that's not on the same plane.
that's not true. The unspeakable
Hold it.
cruelty that you showed there is mismanagement of a commodity. It's not.
The commodity happens to be capable of suffering.
What?
The commodity are creatures capable of suffering. Therefore, they have moral rights. The person right in front of that My argument is that the roots of anti-Semitism are the same roots that leads humans to be unspeakably cruel, and that there is nothing unique about being unspeakably cruel to Jews. A person who can be unspeakably cruel to Jews can be unspeakably cruel to other persons and creatures. My argument, yes.
I don't know how I would put this, but I see one thing that I heard from the movie though is money, that it had to do with money, not for a hatred of cows, not because the cows were looked at as a different race. And with the Holocaust, it's clear that the Nazis did what the Nazis did, and the German people that stood by and watched did it not because they were going to stand to gain money from killing Jews and killing gypsies.
So you saw no relevance to this.
An irrelevance?
Yeah, you didn't see a relevance to the question of what makes us.
No. Don't say that because that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I see some things in here in this movie I saw that do trouble me. I happen to be a vegetarian, so I mean, but that's not even really the point that I'm saying though is that this is primarily for money, and I don't agree.
Well, should we draw an important distinction between distinction involves unspeakable cruelty because money is involved, and unspeakable cruelty when money is not involved. To me, morally, there's not a significant difference. If it's unspeakably cruel and so forth. Now, there are plenty of degrees of unspeakable cruelty, and the more suffering that is involved, the more outrageous it is. But my point is that it's very hard for people to see what is around them. We can all judge, these unspeakable acts, way off, done by others. We can't see our own participation in acts around us, which suggest, to at least some at least, that we're fully capable of some of these things which we find outrageous in others. Yes? Go ahead.
I absolutely see the relevance. If you can't respect all human life, you can become desensitized. If you can't respect this life, sooner or later you won't respect that life or that life or that life. And for the guy at the veterinarian in there, isn't slaughtering cruelty? Only because they don't suffer before they're slaughtered. That doesn't mean it's not cruelty. That's absolutely cruelty. Killing the animals for the sake of, commercial gains. It's absolutely cruelty.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
I have a question about what you described as a moral intuition. You used a description of this moral intuition as an understanding that we're all creatures capable of suffering. I have a question about what you mean then when you say that this intuition is something which transcends language.
I didn't say transcended language.
You did not.
No, I didn't say that. What I said was, and I was not talking, I was talking about the concept of cruelty. And I said, cruelty is the infliction of undeserved suffering on innocent persons or creatures. And I said, if you cannot see anything wrong with that, you lack this moral intuition, your mind. Now, I go on to say that a culture or a group that provides an ideology which justifies their not seeing this is then morally blind. And no culture can say, we don't care whether we inflict suffering on innocent creatures or persons. They can say it, but they violate universal morality when they do. That's the point I'm making. And I hold them responsible for these basic moral tuitions, and I don't care if their social ideology is, or their culture. They have a right to that. They have a right to their culture. They have a right to their religion. They do not have the right to inflict suffering on innocent creatures and persons. This is what I'm saying. And I believe you and I and every other human alive is capable of seeing that that is so, that that is an elemental right of a moral nature. That's my point.
I would agree. So you did not in fact say that it is something outside of language, though.
Yes.
Do you then not make a distinction between killing an animal and killing a human being? Are you saying?
No, I draw a distinction myself personally, but when you take the life of any creature, whether human or animal, it should be with an absolute minimum of suffering. And when the creature or animal is innocent, I can see no reason whatsoever for inflicting suffering on them. Now, personally, individually, this is not part of my argument. So now I'm speaking not as someone who's within an argument, but speaking as an individual person separate from that argument. I find the fact of, say, hunting to be a form of cruelty, because hunting is taking pleasure in the killing of innocent animals. Pleasure must always be second to suffering. Now, many of the animals who are shot are not killed, and they go off partially wounded, and they suffer. And someone is taking pleasure in that act. To me, this is a form of cruelty. So I would argue that to engage in hunting as a sport is to engage in cruelty. And the fact that individuals can do this and not perceive their cruelty, perceive it as a game which is fun and enjoyable, exemplifies the same phenomenon that I'm talking about, to separate yourself from the suffering creature or person and find some way to say, well, they're different. I mean, imagine the roles could be reversed and that the animals had the gun and the hunters were the hunted. They would certainly see it very differently. So that would be my point. Yes?
I have a
The point was that she argued that she thought the analogy was appropriate, and she developed that point.
I understand.
You're probably going to have to sort of project your voice because the people in back are having trouble hearing.
I understand that you assume that having a moral is a universal characteristic of human beings.
Yes, the capability of moral intuition is universal.
What I'm troubled by is, what do you suppose led to the anesthesis of this in virtually all of Europe, not restricted to one place alone?
The question that has been asked is, if the capacity for moral intuition is universal, what has happened so that we have seemingly lost that capacity? I believe that it is in that systematic fostering of group allegiance, which then dampens our ability to see others on the same plane as we see ourselves. So if I see my family as special and different and requiring certain needs to be met, but I see this other, because they're different, as not needing those, and I can come up with a justification for that, then I think that our intuition has to be blinded. That rationalizing capacity that spells out why we're different and special then blinds us to the utilization of that moral intuition. This is the argument that I'm making. Yes?
I have a question about what you mean by undeserved suffering. Why don't you say cruelly suffering or any imposed suffering instead of saying what is undeserved or deserved?
Well, I believe there are conditions, especially where one human inflicts suffering on other humans and may undergo suffering as the result of somebody trying to remediate the suffering that the first is doing. I mean, the Nazis didn't exactly just go away, right? We had to go in there and fight them, and there was suffering on the Nazi side. But I believe that suffering was deserved suffering as against undeserved suffering. So I draw a distinction. I don't think there are no conditions where you might cause others to suffer. But those have to be very special conditions. Yes?
I have a question about evidence.
Okay, question about evidence.
The two kinds of evidence. The one evidence that was manufactured by the Germans to prove how inferior were the Slavs, the Jews, and so
Right.
on. And the other kind of evidence, and they were convinced the people that how do we combat that? That's one question. And the other question is the real evidence that we have today of what happened and people refuting this evidence that this never happened. How do we go about and...
You see, wherever there is something that is valuable and true and important, there are counterfeits of that something. Where there are diamonds, there are zircons. Whereas there is money, there is counterfeits. For every true friend, there are false friends. For genuine love, there's pseudo-love. And lots of people throw around, I love you. But what they do is then a manifestation often not of love. I loved her because, I killed her because I loved her too much. This kind of thing. So evidence and reason is counterfeited everywhere. People present what they claim to be evidence, but it is not evidence. That is, it doesn't show what they say it shows. It shows something else. But people take things very easily. That is, we don't live where people have their critical faculties highly developed. Propaganda works. And it works by distorting evidence, by distorting reason, by making reason appear to be something that isn't reasonable, and vice versa. And so it isn't as if we could simply take these universal capacities, like our capacity to reason or to see basic moral truth, and just give it to our children in simple form so they would never be confused. Because as soon as they enter the world, the propaganda of the world comes down on them and says up is down, and black is white, and green is red, and this is so and that is so, when often the opposite is true. They have to learn how to see through that blinding storm.
That's my question. Help them learn that.
We help them learn it by valuing reasonability and basic moral principles and teaching them not only in the simple cases, but in the complex cases as well. We have to model it ourselves, and we must speak for it and teach for it. Now, I work with teachers every day, and this is, let me tell you what the fundamental response often is. I want to teach for critical thinking. Show me how to do this so I don't have to think. This is really the message which I get. If it's going to be challenging and it's going to confuse me at all, then I don't want it. Just give me the simple handouts. What do you give to the students so that they can fill it out and they can become thinkers? How can I do it without thinking? You see, we look for the easy way. The easy way is never the way. The way to develop your mind is not easy. The way to develop your moral intuitions beyond the sheer capacity is not easy. We have to be willing to practice. You've been waiting.
All right, Dr. Homenko mentioned some, his point leads, I think, to mine, so does what he just said, which is that, all right, if there's this one-dimensional structure between, on the one hand, valuing unity, cohesion, rationality, and on the other, adherence to these egotistic groups, why is it that the story of history is essentially the story of these egotistic groups, that it's a continuous, that's what strikes our, that's what the plot of history is. Even the United States we were founded by people who revered Hume and Locke and so on, who had all these values that you're saying would help us. But I could come up with plenty of examples of terrible cruelties against human beings, let alone done to animals in this country. So I think that any answer to this is going to have to focus on also the question of who makes that judgment, what is justified versus justified suffering. I don't think that this structure really helps us deal with anything because why do we adhere to the egotistical group?
Well, I thought...
Because it's profitable.
Now, I thought that I made clear, at least why I thought we adhere to it, because we're insecure, because we haven't been cultivated in this other direction, because every day in a sea of propaganda, because people are insecure. Pardon?
For our evolutionary origin was that we were gatherer hunters. Human beings didn't need meat to stay alive, but they did need it to stay healthy, and that was certainly something they did all the time, and they took pleasure in the hunt. So we couldn't be here if we were not handed to cruel. I don't think that that's a very satisfactory basis for morality if it requires us.
So you're saying that unspeakable cruelty is absolutely essential for survival?
Well, I wouldn't accept that. I would rather look for a better definition of cruelty.
Yes.
Do you see any correlation between one individual facing agribusiness or one individual facing the Nazi regime?
Do I see a difference, let me repeat the question, between one person facing business and one person facing the Nazi regime? Certainly, there are many very important differences, and I don't want to underplay those differences. But I think, you see, each of us individually, we can't walk out and fight some fascist who's out there in the street marching with jackboots. What we have to look at is the fascist within. That's what we have to look at, I think, because that's where the danger is. And it's very easy, I think, what happens is the swastika becomes a symbol, and those various people have some kind of explicit allegiance to a kind of Hitlerian ideology, become identified as if they are the problem, and all the rest of us are just innocent bystanders who would never accept this ideology. This, to me, is a fundamental problem. I don't know if you're familiar with an experiment conducted at Yale by Stanley Milgram, but it bears on this. Milgram ran an experiment. His question was, how far would the ordinary person go in inflicting pain and suffering on another person just because an authority said, do it? And so he conducted this experiment. He invited people to participate in what he called a learning experiment. Come to Yale, participate in a learning experiment. You'll be paid a little bit of money for your time. So people came from many professions. They were curious about Yale and They're going to participate. Doctors and teachers and so forth, and ordinary workers came too. And everyone who came would come, and there'd be another supposed volunteer there. But the volunteer wasn't a volunteer, this was an actor. And the so-called experimenter came in his lab coat, and he said to the two people, this is an experiment. We're going to see how learning is affected by punishment. One of you will be the teacher, the other will be the learner. I'll flip a coin, we'll see, call it. Coin was fixed, and the actor always became the learner. He was then strapped into an electric chair. And the teacher was instructed, whenever he gives the wrong correlation, give him a 15-volt shock. And then with the second mistake, 30. With the third mistake, 45. 15 volts up each time. Okay, now the question was, how far would the ordinary person go before they said, no, I'm not going to do this? Now psychologists were asked to predict in advance how many would go to the end of the shock board. Because after a while, the person no longer responds, but is apparently dead. Instructions are, the experiment must continue. Consider no answer a wrong answer. Keep inflicting the electric shock on this now lifeless person. Okay, so the question was, how many people would go to the end of the shock board? The psychologists predicted 5%. Stanley Milgram found over 50%. And this experiment was repeated in Europe, in Germany, in various parts of South America, and the percentage varied 5 or 6 degrees, that's all. That is, humans, as we presently stand, if that person was saying, he's dead, but you just keep inflicting it, and I'm not even going to punish you if you don't, because some people got up and they said, I won't do it. They just walked out. Nobody stopped them. And you can see this is on film, the actual people. And there's a book on the subject. It's called, Disobedience. Stanley Milgram. If you look it up in the library, you'll find it. Obedience to Authority. That's the title of the book. So what is Stanley Milgram saying? You and I and people like us will go to the end of the shock board. We will do these things. It's in us to do them. And that's the kind of argument that I'm giving. And I'm arguing we have to begin to look at ourselves. And not just look at these people who march with swastikas on their arms, because there's not a lot of them, quantitatively speaking, today. There's a lot of people who think like them in ways that they don't realize.
I want to get clear on your concept of comparative universalities here. On the one hand, you say we have universally the capacity to develop, to experience and to develop our moral intuition. And I think that's probably true. On the other hand, though, as the case that you just cited points out, we also have a great, I suppose you could call it a universal capacity, to do just the opposite of develop our moral intuition, to follow, to be obedient to commands, regardless of how inhuman or how cruel the commands were. So, with what justification can you posit a superiority of the one moral capacity, the one universal moral capacity, over the other? Are we not equally subject to tendencies to do the moral thing and tendencies to do the immoral thing?
The equality, I mean, in fact, if there is a kind of given strength, it seems to be, to me, that we are more naturally egocentric than we are naturally moral and reasonable. But this does not mean to me, therefore we are justified in giving way to that tendency in us. And that's why I believe education, by education I mean something very broad, because all of us are interact with many people in our life. Our effect on them teaches them something. It sends a message to them about what is right and what is wrong, what is to be tolerated, what is not to be tolerated. And most people's message is, you want to know who's wrong? Those guys over there. This other group out there. We must stop them. Another great thinker, Ambrose Bierce, gave the following definition of a Christian. He said, a Christian is someone who believes that the teachings of the New Testament are admirably suited to the spiritual needs of his neighbor. In other words, we're looking out there. And what we have to do is turn inward. We have to turn inward and realize, let us develop these in ourselves and in our children and in our family and in our nation and in our religion. And let's not wait for the others, because the justification, when they'll do it, we'll do it. But until they do it, we don't have to do it, because we got to protect ourselves against them. And they are different. They are inferior. They are, so therefore we don't have to do it. But then, what are you going to do? Who's going to do it then? Everyone's going to wait for the other guy. Now, I'm not saying this is easy, and I think, to me, it's a kind of lifelong direction. It isn't an answer in the sense you got it, and that's the end. It says instead of this direction, we must go in that direction. And anything worthwhile comes with pain and suffering. So I see it, and requires discipline. The students I see in my freshman class, they lack discipline. Basic moral discipline, basic intellectual discipline. They don't have it. You have two kinds of disabled students. The ones who are not of high intelligence and the ones of high intelligence, who I call the elite disabled. They are disabled in this way. They've been getting high grades for their intelligence. Not for their performance, for their intelligence. And so they can talk smoothly, glibly, fluently, amusingly, and they want a high grade for that. But the truth is not something glib and fluent and amusing. It takes discipline. And so this is of a certain discipline for the intellect and for our moral consciences. And it's not something we can get in just little messages, I think. It's a challenge to each and every one of us as I see it. Yes, sir?
Maybe you could expand a little bit on this. No one has the right to inflict injury undeserved. You didn't say whether that injury, that matter of inflicting, was intentional or unintentional, on purpose. And the area that I was talking about is that we're living in a very, very intensely competitive commercial world, which bases none of their actions on the three areas that you're talking about, being different, special, or inferior. They base it purely on an inherent feature of the business world, profit. And they can and have done great damage to many people. But do they fall inside, or is that another area?
Okay. There's an excellent book entitled The Work of Nations by Robert Reich, who's the present Secretary of Labor. And in it he describes how there is a small group of people who are making more and more money, and a larger group of people in the middle class who are falling further and further down. He points out how the larger group that is making more and more money, and by the way, he attributes to them the power to think on the job. But I think this is, in a sense, where economic motivation, because the argument of his book is unless workers can think for a living, our nation will decrease in its competitiveness.
The example you're pointing out, right, is the people example. I'm pointing out about a non-people entity, the corporation doing it. These are not people. These acts are done in the name of an entity called a corporation. So
I don't think corporations do anything separate from people. I think we have a responsibility to reflect on all of our actions with the view to what impact does it have on others in a wide variety of directions. Some people can see this more readily than others, and those who can see it more readily have a responsibility in keeping with that vision. So to those people who are more insightful, their moral responsibility is greater. To those people who are lesser endowed and can see less, their moral responsibility is less, as I see it. Species allegiance, where all of these kinds of allegiances divide us and make us capable, as I see it, of unspeakable cruelties. On the other side, we have the capacity for moral intuition, for rational behavior, and to take into account basic need of ours and of other species. If we're responsive to this higher part of us, and we cultivate that, we will move away from tremendously powerful, and they're often used as if they're voices of reason and morality. But by their fruits ye shall know them, if I may quote a biblical statement. And the fruits of these forces, as we see them in Yugoslavia, we see them in religious warfare in India, we see them in the way in which people seem to be indifferent to suffering groups that are not a member of them. Whatever I have said that is not persuasive to you, do not accept. What I have said that is persuasive to you, accept only insofar as it continues to be persuasive to you. Follow that line of thought if you find it fruitful, and see where it leads you. Don't follow it if it seems to be false and based on a tremendous confusion or a misperception of something. I simply lay it for you for your consideration. Thank you very much.